Okay, welcome back to Foundations of Christian Thought and Practice. We are doing some videos here in Israel. We're actually in Kiryat Gat in a market here. We're on our annual dig at Tel Azekah. We're on theme number 3. And so theme number 1 is God creates by speaking into the chaos. And we looked at how, in many ways, that is grounded in Genesis 1 and 2. But then we see that theme developing throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible and on into the New Testament. Then theme number 2 is faith is seizing your destiny. We talked about the idea that in the Old Testament, faith is stepping out. If you will, I want to go back to this in the first theme. It is, as human beings, we step into the chaos ourselves. And so we see God stepping into the chaos, speaking into the chaos in Genesis chapter 1. And then we also see the humans now who have the potential to speak into the chaos and create in the chaos. In fact, it's kind of interesting. If you go back and look at Genesis 3, verses 6 and 7, you read on and you see that Eve takes the fruit. And Eve and women have been blamed for the fall wrongly and badly for centuries, for millennia. And yet I think it's very important to understand that Eve was not the only one that was there. And you might say, well, yeah, the serpent was there. No, Adam was there too. And it's very important, at least in my thinking, in my Christian worldview, that if you look at Genesis chapter 3 and verse 7, it says that Eve gave the fruit to her husband who was with her. And the Hebrew there is that with is proximity. And so I'm going to argue that Adam was there, but he was silent. He didn't speak. He didn't say anything. And so you have God who comes to the chaos in Genesis chapter 1 and creates by speaking into the chaos. But Adam, in Genesis chapter 3, when the chaos comes, when the serpent comes, and again, if you know anything about the ancient Near East, the serpent was an important metaphor for chaos. And you see this in particular in Egyptian renderings and etchings and paintings. So the serpent is chaos, and in Genesis chapter 3, chaos raises its ugly head, and Adam does not speak. And so we have here this idea that chaos will always be with us. And again, this is very important. I talked about this a little bit. Most people think, especially in American Christianity, most people think that God is there to take our chaos away, to take our questions away. And I want to argue that that is not Christianity, that is not Judaism. Elie Wiesel, a very famous Jew, still alive to this day, says to be Jewish is to argue with God, to have discussions with God, to basically go have a give and take, to go back and forth. And you see this throughout the Hebrew Bible. And so essentially, to be human is to come to the chaos. It'll never disappear, but to learn to speak beautifully, redemptively into the chaos, to do as God did in Genesis chapter 1, to bring beauty, order, and relationship. Okay, theme 3. Theme 3 is a little more complex than I think some of the other themes, just in the way that we've listed it. But theme 3 is God is one and incomprehensible. Let me say that again. God is one and incomprehensible. And to locate this theme, we're going to go to Exodus chapters 3 and 4. Exodus 3 and 4. And so now we've had 50 years of history in the book of Genesis. Chapters 1 through 11 are what we call primeval history, and then chapters 12 to 50 is what we call patriarchal history, although that leaves out very important women like Hagar and Sarah and Rachel and Rebecca. And so we have patriarchal and matriarchal history from Genesis 12 to 50. When we end Genesis 50, you probably remember the famous story of Joseph. And Joseph was sold by his brothers. He's one of 12 brothers. He is sold by his brothers into Egypt. And he dies in Egypt. But before he dies, he tells his brothers, make sure that you take my bones back to the promised land. One day God will remember you, and I want you to take my bones back to the promised land. It's kind of interesting that, at least within the history as the Bible presents it, the gap between Genesis 50 and Exodus chapter 1 is 400 years. Absolutely unbelievable. And so Joseph makes this promise that one day God will remember the Jews and will bless them again. But that will be 400 years. And when God does show up again in the book of Exodus, there are a multitude of Jews, according to the biblical account, about 1.8 million to 2.4 million there in Egypt. And so you've got all of these Jews, all of these Israelites, but they have no identity. And so a very important theme for the book of Exodus is identity. In fact, if you read Exodus, you'll notice that identity is important and deliverance is important. Moses will deliver them out of Egypt with God's help, and that will then take them down to Mount Sinai, and there they will receive the law, and that becomes their identity. This is very important. To the Jew, the law is something that is their identity. And it is what sets them apart. It is basically what tells the world we are worshipers of Yahweh, that we follow Yahweh. And so as we move into the book of Exodus, we've got literally millions of Israelites, but they have no identity. Eventually Moses will lead them out of Egypt and to the promised land, almost to the promised land. And in doing so, he will also stop along Mount Sinai, receive the 10 commandments, more commandments than that, but this is where their identity will be located. But before Moses can do that, remember he grew up in Egypt, and around the age of 40, he got angry with an Egyptian. He killed that Egyptian, tried to cover it up, didn't work. And so he has to go in exile, and he actually goes down to Midian, down to the southeast. And he will remain in exile for the next 40 years as a shepherd. He'll get married and have children. When Moses is 80 years old, he's up around Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, and he sees a strange sight. One of the most important sights here in the West, in Judeo-Christianity. He will see a bush that is burning, but it is not consumed. And he wants to get close to that bush, and out of natural curiosity, and as he gets closer, there's a voice that comes out of that bush and basically says to Moses, don't come any closer. And in fact, you're now standing on holy ground. Take off your sandals and don't come any closer. What I want to emphasize here is this is the beginning of monotheism. This is the beginning of a God who is not multiple. And so in Judaism and in Christianity, you don't have multiple gods. You don't have gods and goddesses who are there to guarantee your life and basically to help you manipulate life, if you will. You don't have gods and goddesses that are there to manage the chaos. And so Moses can only go so far. And if he goes any farther, we know from other scripture passages, he'll actually die. And so as special as he is, as if you will, as holy as he is, he cannot come into the presence of God. And this is not only the beginning of monotheism, but it's a central idea to monotheism, that God is wholly other. God is incomprehensible. You can never get your hands on God. You can never wrap your mind around God. Can you know God? Yes. But can you know God? Not really. But you can know God yeah, but not really. And so that's why I'm using the term incomprehensible. If we ever get to the place where we can comprehend God as Jews and Christians, we become God. And that is total heresy in both worldviews. And so when we begin with Moses, identity and deliverance, and when we begin even before he goes to Egypt to lead the Israelites out and then down to Mount Sinai, he first has to learn who God is. And in many ways, what he has to learn most is who God is not. And so we have here God revealing the name of God, and that name is Yahweh. It's actually called the Tetragrammaton, which is basically 4 consonants, 4 letters that are not to be pronounced. Practicing Jews do not pronounce the name God. They do not say Yahweh. They call him, blessed be his name, or Hashem, in deference to this. And so Moses will basically say, okay, who are you? And God will answer, Yahweh, I am that I am. And literally in Hebrew, it is, I be who I be. And it's very important to notice that the name that God gives is not a name. It's basically a verb. And so Moses is asking, what's your name? And God basically says, what's it to you? I'm going to be who I'm going to be. And again, this reflects this idea of distance, of transcendence, that God is not ready at hand, it is not accessible, it's not a God that you can see, and not a God that you can cozy up to. But this God is very transcendent. Scholars talk about the concept of the mysterium tremendum. You can hear mystery and tremors trembling in there. And so Yahweh, the God who has a name that is really not a name, is really in action. I be who I be will call Moses to go down and deliver his people out of Egypt, and then into Mount Sinai, and then on to the Promised Land.